Another big storyline that's going through this season is these creators, these people who are essentially undocumented migrants who are stowing away on pressurized craters and are then arriving on Mars. And they're classical refugee or stateless persons, which is in, you know this better than me, but in political philosophy and legal studies, these are hugely significant liminal cases, because because it gets at precisely the core question of these kind of rights frameworks, which is what rights adhere to you as human qua human, and what rights are only available to you as citizen of a state. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And we are two political scientists who have just watched episode 2 of season 5 of For All Mankind, the episode called The Hard Six. We're here to discuss its ideas and its themes, and I think there were big ideas and big themes in this episode. After we've done that, I think we're going to discuss it as the episode as kind of a work of drama and engage in some critical appraisal of that. And then at the end of the video, we'll respond to some of the comments that we got last week. We got some very provocative, interesting and informative comments, which we really do appreciate, and we'd like to kind of engage in a dialogue over them. Episode 2 of season 5, The Hard Six, I think really introduces some major themes, including the most major of all possible themes, which is, unless I'm totally misunderstanding what happened or they're totally misreading their own data, didn't we just discover extraterrestrial life?
Yeah, it seems like as though that's the case. And as you were talking about off camera, it's done in a almost offhand, very matter-of-fact way, which is surprising given, I think, something that we did talk about last week, which was that we both had the sense that this would be a storyline that they were leading up to as the kind of finale, the cliffhanger of the season. And we get it here, I mean, actually at the beginning of episode 2, as I recall, and it doesn't carry the kind of, I don't know, earth-shaking impact that you would imagine that it would.
I thought it could have been not only the culmination of the season, but actually of the series. I could have literally seen a final series, the kind of finale where a blip comes up on a screen and they're like, oh, you know what this means, cut to black and the whole thing's over. So they find that something is making proteins on, is it Titan?
Titan.
On the moon of Jupiter. I do keep wondering, are they going to find a monolith and then a message, the plot of 2010, or does it, all of these worlds are yours, attempt no landing here because something's growing. They find something making proteins on Titan. This immediately put me in mind of a really important idea in philosophy and politics and other spheres, which is the idea of the great filter. And the great filter is tied to the notion of the Fermi Paradox.
Yes.
You know the Fermi? Yes. So Fermi Paradox in brief is just a mathematical equation that says, given the size of the universe and what we know about its composition, of course, the vast majority of which we have no knowledge of, but given what we can extrapolate from what we can see of its composition, there are so many possibilities of life-supporting situations that just as a statistical matter, it's an absolute certainty that not only some life exists, but it should be plentiful. It should be all over the place. And given the kind of distances and time spans involved, that life, at least some of it, should have evolved to be extremely advanced and spacefaring and much more advanced than us, and thus able to find other forms of life. And therefore, in the words of Enrico Fermi, the kind of World War II era Italian physicist, why, when I look up in the sky, are there no space aliens? Where are they? And the Fermi paradox that he developed, and it was on his mind because he was working on nuclear weapons, was perhaps all of these civilizations reach a certain level of technological development and then essentially blow themselves up, and perhaps that's what we're doing here on Earth. The idea of the great filter is a kind of addendum to this that, in my mind, is associated with the philosopher Nick Bostrom, who's known a lot for theorizing about artificial intelligence. But he had a paper sort of 20 years ago when I think it was a probe was going to Mars looking for life. And he said, look, if we find life on Mars, it will be literally the worst news the human race has ever received. And that's really interesting because I think in the show it's going to be received as amongst the best news we've ever received. And that's how we imagine society. We're not alone, and look how clever we are to find life. And Bostrom's point was this: the answer to the Fermi paradox must be that there exists somewhere in the timeline of civilizations a great filter, or the timeline of the development of life, there exists a great filter. And there's two basic possibilities for where the great filter is. And the great filter is something that eliminates almost all civilizations when it occurs. And that's why we don't see the space aliens, because they're all eliminated by the great filter. There's two possibilities. One is the great filter occurs in the timeline, in the point of development at which Fermi imagined it would. It's a highly technologized great filter. Civilizations get advanced enough, they build something that can destroy themselves, and therefore they destroy themselves. And Bostrom said, that's actually really, really good news for us, because the alternate possibility is the great filter is extremely early in the development of life, like before it would be detectable as the kind of proteins they find on Titan. And that something happens that makes it almost impossible for any life of any degree of simplicity or complexity to develop. And that would be really good for us humans, because that would mean we've already passed the great filter. Mm-hmm. And maybe we're the only life that ever has anywhere, or maybe we're one of a very small number. If the great filter is in fact really late, that's very bad news for us, because it's highly likely we're amongst the large numbers of civilizations that never get further than where we are now. Bring this to a conclusion that directly impacts on the discovery of life, we think, on Titan. If you were to find life on Mars, Bostrom was saying, or Titan, or somewhere in our neighborhood, i.e. independently, in incredibly close geographical proximity, life had developed in two parts of our neighborhood, that would mean that life is incredibly common, even more common than Fermi thought, right? Because it must be just sprouting up all over the place, which means that the late great filter thing is the correct hypothesis, right? Because it's developing all over the place, because we've found it twice just in our immediate environs. Worst news humanity could possibly get, because it means we're almost certain to blow ourselves up. So what's received with indifference, it seems, for all mankind, they're kind of vaguely excited, and they're going to kind of follow. Let's check that out. We should follow up on that. Would be earth-shatteringly bad news for humanity, according to the great filter hypothesis.
Yeah, and so that's all very interesting, and it leads me to believe, who knows how intentional any of this kind of thinking is, behind the scenes in the writer room, but given the tenor of the show and its sort of optimistic utopian take on things, I don't believe that it's going to be troubled in that way by the Bostrom's kind of injunction. Right.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's another example of, I think, the show's kind of relentless and, to my mind, really sort of brave and outlying optimism about things as life in general, that it hasn't actually occurred to them that this could be the worst news and it's going to be received as the best possible news. It's also really interesting. You may think troubling or not troubling that the discovery is treated. I mean, A is really expected. And we have to remember, these are different people who have just a different understanding of the world outside of Earth. Maybe they are really expecting this. They're not at all surprised to have found that. So it's a big deal, but it's like discovering a new oil field or something. It's like, yeah, obviously they're somewhere, and we're really happy we've found it. And like the discovery of a new oil field, thoughts immediately turn to, well, that there must be huge commercial applications here. And I think Helios is seeing the ability to sort of discover life first, almost as the ability to put down a rights claim on that life, because they're pretty certain there's going to be some highly commercialized
Helios
opportunities.
becomes the early adapter, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they're very interested in that race. Mm-hmm. They're as interested in going to the moon, but they're largely interested in it for commercial reasons. I do think it was very interesting and very in line with the show's philosophy that the apparent discovery by these robots is, one reason they're not jumping around is that they're like, it's a glitchy feed. We're not sure what the robots, there's a probability attached to this. The robots might have screwed it up, but also that the solution that's alighted upon is not to send better robots.
Yeah.
It's, we really need to send people. Mm-hmm. And that's not just to be certain. It's, Kelly says, this is something humans have to do.
Yeah.
Which is kind of in line with the show's exploration ethos that this is a humanistic show about our discoveries, not the discoveries of technology.
Yeah, and that's consistent with something that we had talked a little bit about last week as well, which is that this is not a show, for all of its technological complexity, that really has much interest in the robotic. Or at least if it does, we rarely see them, right, put on screen. so that would track, right, with the kind of the human-centric elements of the show. Clearly, there are significant mechanical devices and technological capacity that's available to people, but it's something, and this is something you mentioned off camera. This is never. It's not a symbiotic relationship between humans and technology. It is an instrumental relationship. Human beings use tech, full stop, and do not appear to be impacted by the nature of that tech or by the capabilities of that tech themselves.
Yeah, it's tools as tools rather than the masters of us. And one of the commenters used a phrase I liked last week, which was talking about aspects of the darkening of our timeline, and I like that phrase, the darkening of our timeline. One thing that has, if you're of this way of thinking, darkened our own timeline is potentially us losing the distinction between technologies that work for us as tools and technologies that manipulate and change us in ways that we either don't know about or we actually know about and are really unhappy about. And the example that I was thinking of was like the internet and social media as, attention hacking devices, as vectors of, conflict, vectors of misunderstanding, vectors of information siloing. I mean, all the critiques of the information, and that would be an example of a technology that has become somewhat the master of us in the age of the algorithm, determining our chances, what we see, what jobs we get, surveilling us.
Yeah. Yes, I agree that is the iconography of the show. But the history of humanity is that the tools that we use have always transformed us. Sure. In multiple ways, sometimes physical ways. Think about the introduction of the wheel, right? The development of the wheel going, maybe not all the way back, but pretty far back. Think about the introduction of writing, right? Mm-hmm. And the capacity for human beings to put their thoughts and their dreams down on something that's more rather than less permanent. So it is a strange, out of time kind of imagination, it seems to me, of the relationships between human beings and tools in that way. And in a certain way, this, for all mankind's kind of utopian imagination of the full instrumentality of human control over tools is redolent of kind of Enlightenment era imaginations and sensibilities that human beings are at the center of everything, and that human beings are that the human dream, the progressive human dream, is to be in full control of all elements of the earth, all elements of technology, and that human beings have a kind of limitless capacity to dominate the things that they encounter, including tools. So there's a way of seeing this sort of technological utopianism as itself a darkening of the timeline.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. That's entirely true, that the kind of cornucopian approach to how humans would dominate nature, and that would lead to... That's exactly what this is. Yeah. That's its form of utopianism. And, you'd asked me off camera how I thought about this show in relation to another show we've covered on the channel, Alien Earth. Yeah. And I'd been making an argument that, because I'm interested in utopian thought, I'd be making an argument that Alien Earth had a utopian underpinning in the rebelling of the... We won't get into the whole Alien Earth plot summary. But anyway, that approaches its utopianism in a sort of post-human way, right? It's not trying to say humans are the best and humans are, and it's only technology is the problem. It's saying in Alien Earth, it's actually the embrace of each, and the mutual altering of the other is not inevitable and not necessarily dystopian, but it's going to create a new form to take over.
Well, that's the code of the cyborg.
100%, right?
Which is not existing in for all men.
And that's because, and this is Donna Haraway in that line of thought, and that line of thought was sort of explicitly sort of anti-humanist in the way that humanism is classically understood, as saying that humanism in the way For All Mankind is deploying it, which is essentially we're a good species and we just have to let our better angels flower, and we as humans should remain at the top of the food pyramid, and the history is a march of human rationality towards ever greater justice. That is one form of utopianism. The critique of that is, well, actually, the other thing humanism has been associated with is sort of dividing humans amongst themselves, and the Haraway's argument was a feminist argument. So it's also associated with patriarchy. It's associated with dividing people into different races and classes,
domination.
And these things had to be critiqued and overcome in any sort of realistic utopia. So that's one way I think those shows can kind of speak to each other. Yeah. So that's a really interesting point. Yeah. Another big idea I thought was in the show, Jeff, was an idea of, I don't know quite how to explain it, but thinking it through as a political scientist. I know you've done a lot of work on kind of rights and kind of how they're inscribed in legal orders and maybe have to be pursued both inside and outside of legal orders. You've got a really interesting territorial juridical framework going on the Mars colony, in that you have, there's two bases, but there's one main base, and then there's a North Korean annex. The people on the main base are carrying vestiges and the names of their nationalities and their cultures. But then you've got a governor who's a Soviet governor, but he's actually kind of in this liminal space between his Soviet loyalty and his Martian loyalty. And then you've got an incipient, in the Sons and Daughters of Mars, new political identity and political framework. And then overlaid on that is what's obviously an economic and political conflict on Earth between the M6 and the ISN group. And that's where the prisoner has been spirited away to at the end of the episode. And then on top of that, again, you've got these kind of dueling mega corporations in Helios and, what are they called? Kurgan, is that it? Yeah. And the Kurgan Corporation. And each of them each of these judicial forms are exercising sovereign authority at different, at one point, Dev is, Dev, can you protect Lee Jong-il? Can you authorize this mission? Another point, you have to go to Pelevanov. At another point, it's the sheriff. You've got a sheriff in town. It's a really interesting conglomeration.
There are these kinds of plural legal orders in a certain way, all of which are attached in more and less obvious ways to, as you say, a kind of sovereign authority. And the other thing that happens is that the subjects themselves, the individuals, appear to be engaged or enmeshed in these overlapping plural legal orders. But I will admit, I don't quite understand the status of our North Korean original astronaut who's, accused of Lee Jong-il, I think, right?
Yeah. Gil. Yeah.
I don't quite understand his status, and I don't quite understand why he is this kind of rightsless subject.
Well, he defected. That's what happened. And I think it might have happened in the time gap, but he defected from North Korea.
He defects, but then, so I guess what I mean to say is I don't understand the nature of something that we might call citizenship in Mars.
Right.
I don't understand who's in and who's out.
Because it's a liminal space. I mean, this is often true of the colony.
Right.
Right. That's the precise point that you have these. Sorry, I don't mean to talk over you, but you have these contingent or removable rights when you're this kind of subject in this space.
But that's correct, and that's clearly what's happening here. And maybe this will develop. Maybe we'll get a better sense of this as the season goes on. But I don't quite understand what the metrics for inclusion or exclusion are. The metrics for that kind of subjectivity. What makes you a subject of rights in this Mars colony, and what puts you outside of that? So yes, he's a defector, but I mean, what does that mean in Mars, right?
Right. And to where did he defect to the United States?
Right.
Right.
Like what's the new nation that he has defected to? Or how do we understand these nationalities as they exist on Mars? So I hope that we get some better development of those kinds of social and political dynamics as the season goes on, because right now it feels very elliptical and hard to hold on to. I'm not sure why. So what has he done at the end? Has he sought sanctuary now? Does he become a kind of a political prisoner who's seeking sanctuary or asylum? Or what is right? So it seems to me that there's a lot of as yet undeveloped, potentially interesting lines of connection and jurisprudence that we don't really know how Mars society works.
Right. Well, and they've also got, I think it's, I may be wrong, but I suspect it's deliberate, because another big storyline that's going through this season is these craters, these people who are essentially undocumented migrants who are stowing away on pressurized craters and are then arriving on Mars. And they're classical refugee or stateless persons, which is in, you know this better than me, but in political philosophy and legal studies, these are hugely significant liminal cases,
right?
Because because it gets at precisely the core question of these kind of rights frameworks, which is what rights adhere to you as human qua human, and what rights are only available to you as citizen of a state. And to have these liminal cases is precisely where it doesn't only apply to the person in the liminal space. It's absolutely crucial for the person who believes they have secure rights by virtue of just being a person or by virtue of being a citizen of a country. And what you often find is these are a lot more contingent in reality than you had hoped in theory.
Exactly. And along those lines, we also don't really know how government works on Mars. They make references to local hearings, but by whom?
Right.
Who are the magistrates in this society?
Right.
It appears that in some ways, the governor has almost unchecked authority.
And there's a sheriff.
There's a sheriff. What is that? We don't really understand. We presume that the sheriff operates under the ambit of the governor's authority, but that may not be true.
And it's also so you're thinking it's like Deadwood or whatever, right? Like that's when you hear sheriff and you're thinking it's all right. It's this incipient, but where there's going to be a lot of like law of the frontier or but it's also highly bureaucratized. Yeah. So it's this weird hybrid system of or a combination of what seems to be the arbitrary or the locally controlled and the bureaucratized and heavily regulated.
And I hope that those are the kinds of things that they explore and develop as the season goes on, because as of right now, it's for me, it's hard to kind of find my way into understanding how these dynamics are working out in Mars society. Yes, you're here to help in a way.
I'm saying to explain a confusing show in
a way.
Yes. So that I thought was really, really interesting. Dev is in this episode. Here he is. He's not just a sort of striking figure on the cover of Men's Health. He's resplendent before the model of his new dream city of Meru, right? And he's going to build this again, what seems like a utopia on Mars, 1 million person city with all mod cons.
It reminds me of this. Is it in Saudi Arabia? They're trying to build this huge engineering project, the Line.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
It sort of has some real world resonances, it seems like, to that.
That is really interesting in a resource driven economy and stuff. Yeah, that is really, and of course in contemporary terms, what it had always looked like, I don't know if you follow any of these influencers who go and live in like Dubai is the common one, or places in Saudi Arabia and so forth, but they obviously live in the extremely affluent, designed for them kind of Instagram realities. And you do have these weird situations of these in the middle of essentially a desert, this sort of utopian technologized metropolis. And I follow a guy, like bodybuilder guy, Mike Thurston, and he lives in the best tower block, and then he goes in the best gym, and the beach is the best beach. And of course, it's just this hugely artificially constructed bubble. Right. Of unreality, and it has sci-fi kind of connotations to it. And then, of course, tragically, you do find that that's hard to sustain when reality does intrude, as I'm afraid it is in many of these places at the moment.
Right, and it'll be interesting to see if Dev's vision is realized. Like, does it become a kind of a Total Recall Mars bubble city, right? And all the sort of the nightmarish elements that are associated. Given the nature and the trajectory of the show, I suspect it does not turn into that.
Yes.
But it's interesting in that way.
Dev continues to play, I don't know, the vanguard, the Lenin role in utopian thought, right? Which has always been his liminal or paradoxical status, that he's on the one hand, hyper elite, hyper rich, runs this mega corporation. On the other hand, I think genuinely, in the past you've been more skeptical, but I think is genuinely sort of a dreamer. And his notion is he has this sort of effective altruism, except it's not. Well, I don't know if it is altruistic notion, which is it's fine to get like, or you should actually get mega rich if you are then, because then you develop more resources under your control, and because you're the utopian or altruistic person, you then do the greater amount of good, rather than pursuing an occupation that makes you less money, but is more immediately, I don't know, charitable or other focus.
I think it depends on how you see, as you say, it depends on how you see dev, right? What are they going for here? Are they going for an analog to sort of our real world tech overlords, or as given the show's inclinations, are they going for something more positive?
Right.
You're probably correct in the characterization of Dev. I hope that we see more of Dev. I must be honest, at this point, I'm starting to get a little skeptical that he's going to be a major part of this season.
Isn't he? I don't know this because I have such a sort of blinkered kind of set of well, it's not true. I don't have a blinkered set of popular culture that I consume, but I don't consume kind of superhero popular culture. But isn't he the star of some major franchise now, like Mr. Something?
I think he has been cast in some
like a big movie or something,
shows or movies. But I don't know.
Okay, all right. Yeah. I mean, maybe people can tell us in the comments. Like, has his kind of quote exceeded what's available to the show to have him on? Yeah. Very, very regularly, as opposed to just kind of sprinkled in here and there, just as an actly fact. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about in terms of ideas, or do we want to kind of step change here after a brief break and do kind of drama critic and then respond to comments?
Yeah, let's take our break and then we'll come back.
Okay, all right. So we'll be back in just a second. And we are back with our discussion of episode 2 of season 5 of For All Mankind. By the way, Jeff, episode 2 was called The Hard Six. Mm-hmm. Now, rolling a hard six is, I think there's two things to say about that. One is it's a reference to, is it called craps? It's like a dice game or something, and you
craps
is it's like hard to get those numbers. I think this is where the reference is, and you'll love this because I know you like when I talk about Ronald D. Moore and Battlestar Galactica. Yep. So the one of the creators of the show is Ronald D. Moore, who famously, I don't know if I've ever mentioned this, but he worked on a little show called Battlestar Galactica that I occasionally bring up.
I didn't know.
He had the one of the protagonists of that show, Adama, would constantly say this thing like, sometimes he had a very husky, sometimes you got to roll the hard six. And every time, like all the other, it was like an ongoing joke. The other characters would be like, yes, Admiral. Rolling the hard six was a thing that Ronald D. Moore deliberately put in.
And here the grandson also professes ignorance about what he means.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like an in-joke, I think. That would be my reading of that. In terms of this episode as sort of a work of drama away from the ideas and so forth, I had a couple of thoughts, Jeff. You know, I mean, I think people will know we sort of start at different points in our evaluation of this series as a work of quality drama. But I'm going to throw you a couple of bones. There are a couple of elements of this episode which I mostly found very exciting and very interesting. A couple of elements that I thought were a little odd. One was the flatness with which they dealt with the discovery of life on other worlds, which I think was done for the reasons we talked about in the first section, that ideologically they need it to be a big deal for humans. So they had a problem. They needed to motivate people to go search this thing out, and why are they going to go and do this without some sort of signal? And it's sort of implausible that they would always be sending manned missions to the, so they needed to do that. But also they thought it would be an anti-climax, an anti the show's pro-human versus technology ethos to have it discovered by a little digging machine on Titan. So that meant they had to sort of rather downplay what was obviously the most important / terrifying discovery in the history of humankind, which was odd as a work of drama, as a piece of drama, but I think understandable. The other thing it did slightly throw me out of the show was there's a scene of the 3 teenagers.
Yeah.
Kind of, getting high and discussing current affairs. In that they're like, "Did you hear about Lee Jong-il?" Well, and then having a very earnest kind of civics discussion. And I thought, I know these are not even college kids, as I understand. They're on the cusp. Are these the only 3 teenagers in the universe who sit around discussing current affairs and civics?
You didn't do that? Well, in various states of intoxication. Well, look, I'm asking seriously. I did that.
You did?
Yes.
But with that high earnestness, and no, I was like, we were just listening to music.
Of course, this is the time for high earnesty.
What I mostly did at that stage of my life, in that state, was listen to music with deep, profound appreciation that somehow escaped me when I would listen to it in different states of mind, and then wonder is the kind of Indian food shop going to deliver this time of night? Can I get a kebab or some fish and chips from somewhere?
Those are deep thoughts in their own
That's
way.
true, deep and important. So that was my kind of thought dramatically. I mean, what did you make of the episode? Just qua episodic TV
It
drama?
is strange. It's going to be hard to get over the oddity of the discovery of potential life. In the episode, it kind of comes out of nowhere, and it's discovered by characters that we don't know anything about.
Right.
I don't remember them from season 4.
Right.
That was odd, for sure. I remain, less than besotted, I suppose, with the sort of the caliber of what we see on screen in terms of the dramatic development of the characters. There were a couple of things. I found it very strange that, I have no idea who Ed Baldwin has enlisted to help him break out, to do the prison break. I don't know who those characters are. I don't know their names. One guy takes a bullet in the back. No idea who he is.
I did make a comment to you before we started, Jeff, that your problem with Ed's makeup was not that he looks like an aged up Joel Kinnaman, but that he looks like a de-aged Joe Biden.
Hey.
Does that hit home? Is that a good comment or just a nasty thing to say?
It's funny. I hadn't thought of it in that way, and I can't say it resonates particularly, but it does. The other thing we talked about off camera was that some of the aging certainly looks better than some of the other aging. I think Kelly's aging looks good. Aleda's looks good. And maybe it's because as you had responded off camera that, there's kind of less time and there tend to be fewer changes, in that time of life that they're supposed to be in, right? And so there's higher resemblance.
Joel Kinnaman's having to be aged up like 40 odd years, and it is. I watched a Q&A with the actors about a previous season as preparation for the new season. It is quite shocking to see him. IRL, as they say, or in his real.
There's a new show on, I don't know if it's new, but there's a show on Netflix right now in which he's the kind of villain.
Yeah.
The name of which, of course, I cannot remember, but my wife was watching it. And so, he, in that, he's playing him, I don't know, late 40s, early 50s, whatever he is in real life. And so it is a little shocking to see him there. I'd be more interested in seeing what had happened to Ed over the previous 10 years. He's now, it's hard to say. There's a ton of character development that happens to him in the first 4 seasons of the show. Thus far, this feels like kind of his last development, this kind of crotchety radical, right, that we're getting late in life, which would be fine, right? That would be appropriate. Most people tend to stop, right, sort of developing as people once they reach a certain point.
He's continued to do so, which I think is the Uber metaphor for the show, right? In many ways, he is embodying that kind of journey that they're saying humanity's gone on, from Korean War vet and Cold War combatant to now like the person who is pushing everyone to be more radical and to dream bigger and to think bigger. And that even within just a couple of seasons, he's changed his view on one specific issue. If you remember, he had this he was very dismissive of Kelly's search for life in the, in an earlier season. Or she said something like, "You can't drill here because we haven't tested it for life yet." And he's like, "Screw that, we're going to drill where we want, drill bit," or whatever he said. And now in this season, he's extremely solicitous of her hopes and ambitions in this area. And it's not a commercial thing for, it's actually him supporting his daughter, I think, as much as anything else. But he's very big-hearted, very radical, as you say.
And he is, while the grandson says he can still be an asshole, he's much less so, right, than he was in previous seasons.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. All right, I thought we would respond to a couple of comments from. We really valued comments that you'd leave. We try to engage with each and every one of them, and one reason that we really value them is it helps us to think anew about things, or quite commonly provides information on stuff that we missed or haven't understood. We're not perfect viewers of the show by any means. We watch it. We call these reactions because they're not kind of long-form analyses that we've done after watching in each episode 10 times. We record very soon after the episode airs, and so we do miss things and get things wrong. There's a couple I thought we might respond to from last week. One is a comment I think you see on every video about about For All Mankind at the moment, which is, why does this show feel like a prequel to The Expanse?
Yeah, it doesn't to me.
Okay.
I think that the tone of the two shows are radically different. They, in a storytelling sense, they pose, at least with regard to Mars, they pose their stories and present them at pretty radically different periods in the social development and political development of Mars.
But that's the comment, right? A prequel. So, you know, in the prehistory.
I don't see it. I mean, the overall affect and tone of The Expanse is much darker.
I think that's the key.
And I don't think any of the characters in The Expanse fit in the world of For All Mankind and vice versa.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And the Expanse, I think, is very interesting. One point I did think of writing a paper that would explicitly juxtapose those two shows, and making the point that the Expanse was really a continuation of sort of power politics. And, you know, the analogy in The Expanse is it's also Cold War-ish, right? It's like Earth and Mars is like the US and the Soviet Union. Definitely has that militarized, bipolar competition, securitized aspect. But it's a humanity that never escapes from that dynamic, really, in the Expanse. You know, and it certainly as the show begins, obviously there's a teleology to it and a sort of extra human intervention at some point. But that dynamic is never escaped from, whereas For All Mankind is precisely about trying to escape that dynamic. The more interesting question of, is it a spiritual prequel, is something like Star Trek. And because it has the same ethos, really, progressivist kind of utopian ethos. And in the panel discussion I was just referring to, where I said, well, it's really shocking to see Joel Kinnaman without the makeup, one of the questions went to Ronald D. Moore, and the question was, when are we going to see a starship in For All Mankind? You know, there's some kind of schematic drawing of her, and he's like, you know, never. That's not what the show is. But that I think is a better comp than a more accurate comp than The Expanse.
Yeah.
Okay. Other question or other comment that came in was responding to what we'd said last week about why is there no artificial intelligence in the show, that if technology was proceeding at this pace, you would imagine it was a sort of fairly uniform wave, and it would have dragged along or brought forward the development of our current models of artificial intelligence, certainly into the 2010s, which is where we are now. And the comment was made, the history of the internet is very different in the show, in that the US government retained a lot more control well into the 90s and early 2000s. Tim Berners-Lee is portrayed as an activist for a freer internet rather than the creator of the World Wide Web. Because LLMs rely heavily on the internet as a source of massive amounts of data to learn from, it's likely that research in that form of AI might be just as slow, if not slower, in our timeline, which I think is a smart comment, right? And then that does sort of, I think there's two things I want to say to that. One is, good on the show for doing that, because that does provide a plausible explanation. You know, it helps the coherence of the world building that they've developed that. The other is, I think they've done that deliberately, not just for narrative consistency in show universe, but because of the earlier thing we talked about, that they're trying to retain a world in which humans are control tools rather than are mastered by other intelligences or technologized intelligences, whether it's internet, social media, or nowadays LLMs.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although it does create a strange wrinkle in this storytelling universe. It's really difficult, and you had mentioned this offhandedly off camera, it's really difficult to imagine how it is exactly that government keeps control of this technology.
Right.
And if it does so, that implies a very different posture between governmental power and citizen activity than I think the show wants us to take away.
Require enormously authoritarian efforts.
Yes.
In countries that we are led to believe are more free than they are in our time.
And none more so, obviously, than in the United States.
Yeah.
So that would be interesting to think about, right? What would an alternate history of For All Mankind look like, right? And this could be a way in that actually this is actually quite darker, much darker of a reality and much more authoritarian than the show is putting on screen. Yeah. And one of the bits of evidence, maybe one of the primary bits of evidence, is the fact that actually technology is not openly available. There isn't transparent capacity to engage from something like a private sector, right? So that would be interesting, right? To kind of, what would happen if you reran For All Mankind? And I suppose that in some ways they're sort of doing that with this spinoff on the Star City. But if you reran the show on its kind of on its own terms, right? Looked inside of its own wrinkles, could you tell a different story than the one that they are actually trying to tell?
Yeah, and this was the great genius of Philip K. Dick's great alternate history novel, The Man in the High Castle, which is the man in the High Castle actually contains multiple alternate realities. And you're shown at one point in the novel, you think you're being shown a glimpse or returned to our reality, but actually there are multiple ways. There's one in which Churchill is still British Prime Minister and Britain is the major superpower alongside this. There's all sorts of different configurations of the ways things could have gone. We don't have time to get into it now, but as you were speaking about, potentially more authoritarian United States, at least as regards the internet and that kind of exchange of information, it also would maybe explain something I think they are doing in the show, which is an increasing paralleling between the Soviet Union and the United States. We'd said in the previous season, it's really weird that the Soviet Union not only persisted but experienced tremendous economic growth, but became no less authoritarian. Maintained a strong authoritarian security state and so forth. Maybe that's the argument. The Soviet Union in some dimensions became more American, and American in some dimensions became more Soviet. Maybe that's what's going on.
But also, as you had also said off camera, it's because it's also why we don't see China really at all. Is that in the show's imagination, the Soviet Union is playing the China role,
right? Yeah. Right. Yes, exactly. The role that China plays in our current kind of political
massive economic development without the accompanying political freedom.
Right, and strict control over the internet.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, good. So anything else you'd like to discuss in this episode? All right, good. So thank you for watching. We appreciate any feedback you might have. Please leave us your comments. We always try to engage in them. We do genuinely find them really interesting spurs to thought, and it's good to hear from you. But on that bombshell,